France, a land of soaring castles, mighty kings, and fearless knights, but also a land haunted by fire, by war, and by a plague that silenced entire cities. Close your eyes. Picture bustling streets filled with traders, bakers, and children at play. Now watch them vanish. Markets stand empty. Doors are locked. And the only sound that fills the air is the toll of church bells, not for celebration, not for prayer, but for death. This was medieval France, a kingdom of power and beauty, yet a kingdom scarred by battles, betrayals, an endless struggle. And then, from the shadows of fear, a teenage girl steps forward, simple, poor, unknown. Her name, Joan of Arc, the warrior saint, the girl who claimed to hear voices from heaven and dared to lead an army against impossible odds. This is not a fairy tale. This is the real story of medieval France, a story of faith because it is the beating heart of the Middle Ages. When people imagine medieval times, they see castles rising over rivers. They hear the clash of knights in shining armor. They picture kings and queens ruling from thrones of stone, and they feel the power of the church echoing through great cathedrals. All of that, kings, knights, castles, religion, comes alive in the story of France. France was not just another kingdom. It was the stage where Europe's biggest dramas unfolded. The Crusades, the 100 Years' War, the Black Death, and the rise of Joan of Arc. Each one left marks still felt today. Think about it. The Crusades began with a call from the Pope in France. French knights marched across continents, carrying banners of the cross. They changed not only religion, but trade, culture, and power in Europe. The castles of France still stand as reminders of a time when stone walls meant survival. They were homes, fortresses, and symbols of authority. Each castle told its people, here is power, here is protection. And then there were the kings, some weak, some strong, but all shaping the destiny of Europe. From Charlemagne's dream of empire to the Capetian kings who laid foundations of modern France. Medieval France was also a land of faith. The Catholic Church was everywhere, from towering cathedrals like Notre Dame to small monasteries tucked into valleys. Religion was not just belief. It was law. It was politics. It was daily life. But why should we care today? Because France's medieval story is Europe's story. When France fought England for 100 years, it wasn't just about land. It was about identity. What does it mean to be French? What does it mean to belong to a nation? Questions we still ask today. And then came Joan, a teenage peasant girl who walked into history and gave France hope when hope was. So who founded medieval France? To answer that, we need to travel back, long before Joan of Arc, long before the Crusades, back to the time of the Franks, a powerful tribe that rose after the fall of the Roman Empire. While much of Europe was collapsing into chaos, the Franks were building something new. Their first great leader was Clovis. In the late 5th century, he united the Frankish tribes. He converted to Christianity, and with that one move, he tied his kingdom to the power of the Catholic Church. It was the beginning of a bond between France and faith, a bond that would shape its future for 1,000 years. But the true giant of early France came next, Charlemagne, the warrior king, the conqueror, the man Europe still calls the father of the West. Under Charlemagne, the Frankish kingdom became an empire. He expanded it across much of Western Europe. He built schools. He pushed for learning. And on Christmas Day, in the year 800, the Pope crowned him Emperor of the Romans. For the first time since the fall of Rome, Europe had a new emperor. This was more than just a crown. It was the idea of Europe reborn. And it started in France. But empires rise, and empires fall. After Charlemagne's death, his empire broke apart. His heirs fought each other, and the kingdom splintered. Out of this struggle, new dynasties rose, the most important of them all, the Capetians. In 987, Hugh Capet was elected king. At first, his power was small. He controlled little more than the land around Paris, but the Capetian line would last for centuries. They slowly expanded their rule, and with each generation, France grew stronger. This was the birth of medieval France as we know it, from the tribal chiefs of the Franks to the empire of Charlemagne, to the dynasty of the Capetians. France was no longer just another kingdom. It was becoming the center of medieval Europe. Think about it. Without the Franks, there would be no medieval France. Without Charlemagne, there would be no vision of a united Europe. And without the Capetians, there would be no foundation for the powerful French monarchy. So who founded medieval France? The answer isn't one man. It was built step by step, stone by stone. From Clovis to Charlemagne to Hugh Capet. Together, they created the kingdom that would one day give rise to knights, crusaders, kings, and Joan. What was life like in medieval France? Not for the kings and queens we read about, but for the people who lived behind the castle walls, in the villages, in the fields, and in the churches. To understand it, imagine a world built on one system, feudalism. At the top stood the king. Below him, powerful lords and nobles. Each swore loyalty in exchange for land and protection. And beneath them, knights armored warriors bound by honor and service. But at the very bottom were the peasants, men and women who worked the land from sunrise to sunset, feeding everyone else, yet owning almost nothing themselves. Let's start with the castles. Stone fortresses that dominated the countryside. They weren't just homes for nobles. They were symbols of power and fortresses of war. Inside their walls, feasts were held, alliances made, and armies gathered before battle. Now picture the knights, the elite warriors of their age. They trained from childhood. They lived by the code of chivalry, to be brave, loyal, and to defend the weak. But knights weren't always noble heroes. Sometimes they were ruthless, their swords serving whoever paid them. Life for the peasants was very different. They lived in small wooden huts, worked long hours in the fields, and owed taxes to both their lord and the church. Bread, porridge, and vegetables were their meals. Meat was rare, a luxury only on special days. And yet, despite hardship, villages were filled with life, markets, festivals, and the rhythm of the seasons. And then the clergy. In medieval France, the church was everywhere. Priests guided the daily lives of villagers. Monks in monasteries copied books, preserved knowledge, and prayed for the souls of the people. The grand cathedrals like Notre Dame in Paris towered above the cities, reminding everyone of the church's power and presence. Religion wasn't just faith. It was the law, the calendar, the heartbeat of life itself. Every birth, every marriage, every death, all passed through the hands of the church. So daily life in medieval France was not one life, but many. The noble feasting in his hall, the knight sharpening his sword, the peasant tilling the fields, the monk bent over a manuscript by candlelight, not all tied together by duty, by loyalty, and by faith, and all living under the shadow of the same. Why was the church so powerful in France? To answer that, we need to step inside the heart of medieval life. Everywhere you turned in France, the church was there. From the smallest village chapel to the mighty cathedrals rising over cities like Paris and Reims, the church was more than religion. It was law. It was government. It was the keeper of knowledge and the voice of God on earth. Imagine a monastery in the French countryside. Quiet stone walls, monks moving silently through gardens and libraries. Inside, by candlelight, they copied books by hand. They preserved ancient knowledge, while the outside world was torn apart by war. Now picture a cathedral. The size, the beauty, the stained glass glowing in the sun. It wasn't just a building. It was a symbol, a reminder of heaven towering above the people. When a villager walked inside, they felt small, but also safe, believing they were under the protection of God. And above it all stood the Pope in Rome. His voice carried across Europe. He could crown kings, or strip them of power. French rulers needed the Church's blessing to rule. Without it, they were nothing more than warlords. The Church also controlled daily life. Births, marriages, deaths, all passed through the hands of priests. Every feast day, every calendar, every festival was set by the Church. And then there was money. The Church collected tithes, a tax from every family. Even the poorest peasants gave a portion of their harvest. With that wealth, the Church became the richest institution in France. But with power came influence. The Church shaped minds. It told people how to live, what to believe, what to fear. It promised heaven, and it warned of hell. This power could unite, and it could also divide. It inspired crusades that sent French knights across continents. It built cathedrals that still stand today. But it also gave the Church immense control over kings, armies, and ordinary lives. So why was the Church so powerful in France? Because it held the keys to every part of life, the body, the soul, the crown, and the sword. In medieval France, to defy the Church was to defy God himself. And that is why, when Joan of Arc claimed she heard voices from heaven, the world listened. The Church's blessing could make you a saint, but its judgment could burn you at the stake. Stay with me, because next we follow those voices of faith and fury into one of the most dramatic chapters of history, the beginning of the Crusades. What role did France play in the Crusades? The answer: almost everything. It was here, in France, that the call for the Crusades first thundered out. The year was 1095. Pope Urban II stood before a great crowd at Clermont. His words carried fire. Christians must march east to free the Holy Land from Muslim rule. The crowd erupted. Knights raised their hands. Peasants wept. The cry of Deus Vult, God wills it, spread like wildfire. And who were the first to answer? The Knights of France. Men born into a culture of war, bound by faith, driven by honor and salvation. They sold their land. They left their families. They sewed crosses to their tunics. And they set out on a journey across continents. One of the most famous among them was Godfrey of Bouillon, a French noble, a warrior of great renown. He became one of the leaders of the First Crusade. Through battle, blood, and hardship, he helped capture Jerusalem in 1099. And when victory came, the Knights of the Crusade looked to Godfrey. He refused the title of king. Instead, he called himself the Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. For him, ruling the Holy City was not about crowns. It was about faith. But Godfrey was not alone. Across the centuries, wave after wave of French nobles and knights took the cross. From Count Raymond of Toulouse to King Louis, the Ninth himself, who led not one, but two crusades. France became the heart of the crusading spirit. Its knights filled the armies. Its nobles financed the campaigns. Its kings gave legitimacy. And its people carried the belief that by marching east, they were marching toward heaven. The Crusades shaped France in return. They brought back new goods, new ideas, new connections to the wider world. But they also drained wealth, cost countless lives, and sowed seeds of conflict that would last for centuries. For the people of medieval France, the Crusades were not distant wars. They were a mission of faith, Every family knew someone who marched, who fought, or who never returned. So, what role did France play in the Crusades? It was the spearhead, the driving force, the land where it all began. When you think of the Crusades, think of French knights riding under the blazing sun, their banners bright, their swords drawn, believing with every step that they carried the will of God. Stay with me, because after faith and fire came a new order of warriors. Men bound not just by steel, but by the code of honor itself. Next, we'll step into the world of knights and chivalry. Who were the knights of France? And what did they do? Picture a man on horseback, steel armor glinting in the sun, a shield painted with his family crest, a sword at his side. This was the image of power in medieval France. The knight. But a knight was more than just a soldier. He was the symbol of an entire way of life. He lived by a code, the code of chivalry. Chivalry called for loyalty to one's lord, for bravery in battle, for protection of the weak, and for devotion to God. It was part law, part religion, part legend. It shaped how knights fought and how they were remembered. Training began young. At 7, a boy from a noble family became a page. He served in a castle, learning manners, faith, and riding. At 14, he became a squire. He trained with weapons. He cared for his lord's horse and armor. And when he proved himself in battle, he was knighted. A ceremony filled with prayers, oaths, and the blessing of the church. But knights didn't just fight wars. They fought in tournaments, great festivals where lords and ladies gathered to watch. The joust was the most famous. 2 knights charging at full speed, lances ready, the crash of impact echoing across the field. These contests were more than games. They were practice for war, and a way to win honor and fame. On the battlefield, French knights were feared across Europe. They led charges that could break enemy lines. Their heavy cavalry was the shock force of medieval armies. But they were not always noble heroes. Some fought for money, others for glory, and many for the spoils of war. Knights also played a role in faith. The church praised them as defenders of Christianity. It blessed their swords. It called them to fight in the Crusades. In many ways, knights became the church's warriors. Still, the reality of a knight's life was harsh. Armor was heavy. Battles were brutal. And loyalty often meant dying for one's lord. Yet despite the blood and the mud, the image of the knight endured. Songs and poems celebrated them. Stories of brave warriors rescuing maidens, slaying dragons, or standing against impossible odds. These legends shaped how people saw knights, even long after the Middle Ages ended. So, who were the knights of France? They were the warriors, the protectors, the champions. Men bound by oath, faith, and ambition. Some noble, some ruthless, but all part of the beating heart of medieval France. Stay with me. What caused the 100 Years' War? To answer that, we need to step into a time of crowns, ambition, and bitter rivalry. The year was 1337. France and England were already neighbors in tension. But now, a spark lit the fire. The French king, Charles IV, had died with no son. His nephew, Edward III of England, believed he had the strongest claim to the French throne. But the French nobles disagreed. They invoked an old law that barred inheritance through the female line. Instead, they crowned Philip VI of Valois to Edward. This was an insult. To France, it was a defense of their crown. And so began a war that would rage for more than a century. But the throne was only part of the story. This war was also about land. England still held territories in France, rich lands in Aquitaine and Gascony. France wanted them back. England wanted more. It was also about pride. 2 kingdoms, side by side, each determined to dominate the other. The war unfolded in brutal chapters. At first, the English struck hard. Their longbowmen, deadly at range, cut down waves of French knights. Battles like Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356 left France humiliated, but France did not break. The war dragged on, generation after generation. Sometimes fought in open battle, other times in raids, sieges, and uneasy truces, and in the middle of it all, the people suffered. Villages burned. Fields lay empty. The Black Death struck during the conflict, killing millions, leaving a broken land between battles. So why was France constantly at war? Because the war became more than crowns and castles. It became a struggle for survival, a fight for identity, for the right to say, "This is France." By the early 1400s, it seemed England might win. They captured Paris. They forced a treaty that disinherited the French king's son. France was broken, divided, on the edge of collapse. And then, something remarkable happened. Out of despair, a new figure rose. Not a king, not a noble, but a teenage girl from a small village. Her name was Joan of Arc. She would turn the tide of the 100 Years' War and give France a chance at redemption. So what caused the 100 Years' War? It was a storm of ambition, land, pride, and power. But what kept it alive for more than a century was the refusal of either side to bow. This was not just a war of kings. It was the birth of nations. France and England forged their identities on its battlefields. How did Joan of Arc become a leader? To understand that, imagine France in its darkest hour. The year was 1429, the 100 Years. War had dragged on for nearly a century. English armies occupied French lands. The French king's throne was weak. The people had lost hope. And in a small village called Domremy, a teenage girl was hearing voices. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc. She was just 17, illiterate, the daughter of farmers. By every measure, she was nobody. But Joan believed the voices were saints. Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret. They told her she had a mission to save France, to drive out the English, to see the Dauphin, Charles, crowned king. At first, no one believed her. A peasant girl commanding armies? It sounded impossible. But Joan refused to give up. She traveled miles to reach Charles. And when she stood before him, her confidence shook the court. Charles tested her. He even disguised himself among his courtiers. But Joan walked straight to him, bowed, and spoke with a certainty no one could ignore. Something about her faith, her fire, her presence moved people. This wasn't just a girl. This was a symbol. A spark in a land drowning in despair. Against all odds, Charles gave her a chance. Joan was dressed in armor. She carried a banner, not a sword. And she rode at the front of the army. For the soldiers, her presence was electric. She was proof that God had not abandoned France. And for the enemy, she was terrifying. A peasant girl claiming divine guidance. In days, Joan transformed from unknown villager to commander of men. Not by birth, not by wealth, but by faith, by conviction, by the power to make others believe. Her rise was nothing short of miraculous. 1 year earlier, she was tending sheep. Now, she was leading armies into battle. So how did Joan of Arc become a leader? She believed so strongly, so fiercely, that her belief became contagious. She gave France something it had lost for decades, hope. And with hope, the French would march again. With Joan at their side, they would fight battles that changed history. Stay with me, because next, we ride with Joan into her greatest triumph. The siege that turned the war. The victory that lifted a nation. The day the world first saw her power, the siege of Orleans. What battles did Joan of Arc win? The answer begins at Orleans. It was Pack. The English had tightened their grip on France. They besieged Orleans, a key city on the Loire River. If Orleans fell, France would fall with it. For months, the French defenders held out, but they were exhausted, starving, and desperate. And then Joan arrived. She rode into the city dressed in white armor, carrying her banner high. Not a sword, but a flag, painted with the image of Christ. To the people, she looked like a savior. To the soldiers, she was living proof that God had chosen France. At first, the French commanders doubted her. What could a teenage girl know of war? But Joan refused to stay silent. She demanded action. No more waiting. No more fear. Her courage was contagious. When she rode to the city walls, men who had been broken by months of defeat found new strength. They followed her into battle. Day after day, Joan led attacks on the English forts. She took an arrow to the shoulder, but returned to the fight, refusing to retreat. Her faith, her fire, her defiance, it turned the tide. Within a week, the English lifted the siege. The impossible had happened. France had won. The victory at Orleans was more than a battle. It was a miracle. A turning point in the 100 Years' War. The girl no one believed in had saved the kingdom. But Joan's mission was not over. Her voices told her to see Charles crowned king. So she marched with him to Reims. Through hostile territory, through enemy towns, the French army followed her. Every step felt like destiny. And on July 17, 1429, inside Reims Cathedral, Charles was anointed and crowned Charles VII of France. Joan stood at his side, her banner raised high. For the people, it was more than a coronation. It was the rebirth of France. The Dauphin was now a king. The war was no longer a struggle in the dark. It had purpose. It had hope. So, what battles did Joan of Arc win? She lifted the siege of Orleans. She secured victories along the Loire, and she made the crowning of Charles VII possible. Joan did not just win battles. She gave France back its spirit. She proved that one person's belief can move an entire nation. Stay with me, because victory would not protect Joan forever. Ahead lies betrayal, trial, and fire. The fall of Joan of Arc, and the rise of her legend. Why was Joan of Arc executed? The answer lies in betrayal, fear, and politics. After her victories at Orleans and Reims, Joan had become the face of France. A teenage girl in shining armor, leading soldiers, inspiring thousands, and standing beside a newly crowned king. But power is dangerous. And in medieval politics, power makes enemies. In 1430, Joan led a campaign near Compiègne. During the fighting, she was thrown from her horse. She was captured not by the English at first, but by the Burgundians, French allies of England. And for a price, they sold her to the English. To England. Joan was more than an enemy. She was a threat to their cause. If she truly spoke for God, then their claim to France was doomed. So they decided to destroy her. Not on the battlefield, but in a courtroom. Joan was put on trial in Rouen. The charges? Heresy, witchcraft, cross-dressing. The court was stacked against her. English sympathizers filled the seats. The judges were loyal to England's cause. They twisted her visions, mocked her voices, and demanded she deny them. But Joan stood firm. She was uneducated, yet she outwitted trained scholars. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me." A simple answer, but one no theologian could challenge. Still, the verdict was decided before the trial began. Joan was found guilty. The sentence was death. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was led to the marketplace in Rouen. She wore a plain white gown, her hands bound, her eyes fixed on a wooden cross held before her. The crowd wept. Even her English enemies felt uneasy. But the fire was lit not as the flames rose. Joan called out the name of Jesus. Witnesses said a white dove flew from the smoke. She was only 19. The English believed they had destroyed her. But in death, Joan became more powerful than ever. 25 years later, the church retried her case. This time, she was declared innocent. Her name was cleared. And centuries later, in 1920, the Catholic Church made her a Saint. So why was Joan of Arc executed? Because she was too dangerous to be allowed to live. Because her courage threatened kings and armies. Because her faith was stronger than their fear. But in trying to silence her, they made her immortal. Joan of Arc died in fire, but rose in legend. Stay with me, because while her story ends in smoke, France's struggle was far from over. Ahead came another enemy, not an army, not a king, but a plague that would kill millions, the Black Death. How did the Black Death affect France? To answer that, imagine a shadow moving across the land. A shadow no sword could stop, no knight could fight, no king could command. It began in 1347. Ships arrived in Europe, carrying grain, and rats. On those rats were fleas, and in those fleas was death. Within months, the plague swept across France. From Marseille to Paris, from villages to castles, no place was safe. The symptoms came fast: swollen lumps under the skin, high fever, coughing blood. Most victims died within days. Whole families vanished. Markets emptied. Church bells rang endlessly, not for prayer, but to mark the dead. In the countryside, fields were left unplowed, harvests rotted, famine followed. In the cities, the streets filled with carts carrying bodies. Graveyards overflowed. Mass pits were dug. Fear spread faster than the plague itself. Some believed it was God's punishment. Others blamed strangers, outsiders, even neighbors. Communities turned on each other. And the numbers? Unthinkable. Historians believe up to half the population of France was lost. Millions gone in just a few years. The church, once the unshakable guide of life, suddenly seemed powerless. Priests died alongside their flocks. Monks in monasteries fell by the dozens. People asked, if the church cannot save us, who can? Society began to change. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Peasants demanded higher wages. Some even walked away from the land, seeking freedom in towns and cities. The old order of lords and serfs was cracking. For the survivors, life was never the same. A constant reminder of death hung over them. Art and literature turned darker. Images of skeletons, of grim reapers, of dance with death appeared everywhere. The Black Death was more than a plague. It was a turning point. It reshaped France, its economy, its faith, its people. And yet, France endured. The villages slowly refilled. The fields turned green again. And out of tragedy came change. A new world, harsh but different, was beginning to form. So, how did the Black Death affect France? It killed millions. It shattered trust in the church. It gave peasants new power. And it left scars that never fully healed. When you walk the old streets of France, when you step into a medieval cathedral, remember, so many who built those walls never lived to see them finished. The plague took them, but their world carried on. Stay with me, because next we'll see how this devastation reshaped society and economy, how the loss of life cracked open the foundations of feudalism and gave birth to something entirely new. How did the plague change medieval society? The answer lies not just in death, but in what came after. When the Black Death swept through France, It left entire villages empty, fields overgrown, workshops abandoned, churches without priests. At first, it seemed like the end. But slowly, the survivors began to rebuild. And in that rebuilding, France was transformed. The biggest change was in the land. With so many peasants dead, lords no longer had enough workers. For the first time in centuries, peasants had power. They could demand higher wages, better treatment. Some even walked away from their lords' estates, seeking new lives in towns and cities. Freedom that once seemed impossible was suddenly within reach. This cracked the old system of feudalism. The pyramid of king, lord, knight, and peasant began to crumble. Power was shifting. Towns grew stronger. Merchants gained wealth. And a new middle class started to rise. The seeds of modern France were being planted, but the change was not only economic. It was also spiritual. The church had been the great protector of medieval life, but the plague showed its limits. Priests died like everyone else. Prayers did not stop the sickness. For many, faith was shaken. Some turned to superstition, others to rebellion, and still others clung more tightly to belief than ever before. The trauma also reshaped culture. Art, once filled with images of saints in paradise, now showed skeletons, skulls, and the dance of death. Literature spoke of life's fragility, of how quickly joy could turn to ash. Even warfare changed. With fewer knights and more mercenaries, armies became less about noble honor and more about survival. The age of the heavily armored knight was beginning to fade. For ordinary people, life was still hard. But the world was different now. If you were a peasant, your work mattered more than ever. If you were a lord, your grip on power was weaker than before. And if you were a king, you ruled a nation scarred, but one that was learning to adapt. So, how did the plague change medieval society? It shattered the old order. It gave peasants new voices. It shifted wealth into new hands. And it pushed France toward a future that looked very different from its past. The Black Death was tragedy, but it was also transformation. From the ashes of loss, a new society began to take shape. Stay with me, because next, we'll witness the final steps of that transformation. The decline of knights, the rise of gunpowder and kings, and the end of the medieval world in France. When did the medieval period end in France? The answer is not one single date, but a transformation that changed the kingdom forever. By the 15th century, France had endured it all. A century of war with England, the plague that killed millions, and the rise and fall of Joan of Arc. But now, a new world was breaking through the cracks of the old. First came the decline of the knights. For centuries, they had been the pride of France. Armored horsemen charging into battle, symbols of honor and power. But gunpowder changed everything. Cannons smashed through castle walls. Handheld guns pierced armor, once thought invincible. The knight, once the master of the battlefield, was slowly fading into legend. Castles, too, were no longer untouchable. Stone walls that had stood for generations crumbled under the thunder of artillery. Power now belonged to whoever controlled the new weapons of war. And in this new age, kings grew stronger. The Capetian line had passed, but the Valois kings were building something lasting: a centralized France. A nation not just of lords and fiefs, but of one crown, one ruler, one state. The monarchy expanded its authority. It raised professional armies. It collected taxes more directly. France was no longer a patchwork of feudal lands. It was becoming a united kingdom. At the same time, new ideas were stirring. From Italy came whispers of a renaissance. Art, science, and human reason were beginning to challenge the old medieval ways. France, too, would feel this spark. Religion remained powerful, but the unquestioned dominance of the church was no longer the same. The plague, the wars, the corruption, all had planted seeds of doubt. In time, these doubts would grow into great changes. By the late 1400s, the medieval world of France, with its knights, castles, and feudal order, was giving way to something new. A France of kings with absolute power. A France that would step into the Renaissance, and eventually into the modern age. So, when did the medieval period end in France? It ended when knights gave way to gunpowder, when castles lost their strength, when kings tightened their grip, and when new ideas began to reshape old beliefs. It ended not with one event, but with the slow, powerful rise of a nation. From the chaos of war and plague, France emerged stronger, more united, and ready to lead Europe into a new era. The medieval age closed its gates, and the dawn of modern France began. Stay with me, because in the final chapter, we'll look back at it all. The legacy of castles and cathedrals, the courage of Joan of Arc, the devastation of the plague, and how medieval France still lives on today. The story of medieval France is more than battles and kings. It is the story of a nation born through fire, faith, and struggle, from the thundering hooves of knights to the echoing chants of cathedrals, to the final cry of Joan of Arc in the flames. Every moment shaped the France we know today. And now, the echoes of that age call to us. They invite us to remember, to learn, to carry these stories forward. So if this journey moved you, don't let it end here. Dive deeper. Explore more. Because history is not just the past, it's the mirror of who we are. Watch our next story. Step into another land of castles, kings, and battles. Discover how the struggles of medieval times still shape our world. Subscribe, share, and join us. Be part of keeping these stories alive, because every legend, every battle, every voice from the past still has something to tell us today. This was the story of medieval France, and the journey is only just beginning.